Okay. So last week, remember we went through all these and we talked about, oh, this is not calibrated at all. We talked about what the different types of balance were, and we looked at each of these as an example, and we said whether it was formal or informal, and then those subsets of formal and informal were, of course, formal would be, do you remember what types of balance fit under the formal category? There were all types of, that word that starts with an S.
Symmetry.
Symmetry, yes. Do you remember the 4 types of symmetry that count as formal balance?
Radial.
Radial is one of them. What's another one?
Inverted.
Inverted. You guys get the hard ones first.
Radial.
Radial, inverted.
Pure.
Pure.
Asymmetrical.
Asymmetrical is on the informal side.
I'm just kidding.
You're ahead of us. That's okay. Preemptive symmetry. Radial, inverted, pure, and what's the one that's almost pure but not quite?
Approximate.
Approximate. Okay, so we ended on this one if I remember correctly. And this was the Lascaux cave paintings. Remember we said that balance in artwork is not a new concept, right? 15,000 BC, many, many thousands of years ago. Okay, 17,000 years ago approximately, that that art started to be documented and started to be recognized as a thing, right? And even still, they were using formal and informal balance. Okay, so what kind of balance was this one again? Guys, I need you to like put your stuff down and look up at what we're doing so you can participate.
Is it inverted?
It is not inverted.
Approximate.
This is approximate. Yes, very good. And why did we say that this was approximate and not pure? Because it's close on both sides, but it's not exactly the same, right? We see some kind of mirror imaging that's similar where like the two, whatever these are, bowls or whatever, are looking at each other. But then there are lots of other elements in here that are not repeated or that are not exactly the same. So this one would be approximate. Good. One of my most favorites. So pay attention. What type of balance, now I know it's been a while, think back to where you sorted those cards, think back to what each of those types of symmetry means. Where would we say that this one, where would we group this one? Luke, do you know?
Radial.
Not radial. There are some circular forms in there. But remember we said just because it's a circle doesn't mean it's radial.
Asymmetry.
It is asymmetry. Yes, very much so. So if we look at the whole painting, okay, if we did the fold test, right? Now don't like fold your paintings in half on a regular basis, but if you think of it that way, if we did that fold test and we kind of ran on axis up the middle, is it the same on both sides? Yes or no?
No.
No, it is not. Very good. So, let's ask you a tougher question. What balances this? Because it is balanced, right? Do you agree? Okay. What balances this even though it's not matching on both sides?
The detail on the right and the large.
You're talking about this thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So if we were to read some more specific research on this painting, okay, this big, large, dark, swoopy shape, it's called the cypress trees. Okay, so this is Van Gogh's interpretation of cypress trees. So would you agree that this is a pretty dominant shape? When you look at the painting as a whole, this is one of the more dominant parts. Okay, so what on this side balances the darkness, and dominance of that? You got excited. The detail on this side, so there's a lot of detail kind of happening through here. That's part of it. What'd you say? Town? I would say that's kind of incorporated or included when we say like the detail. What specifically is balancing the darkness from that shape?
The light.
Not the light.
The mountain.
The mountains right here. See where it gets darker right here? And it's kind of a subtle thing, right? It's not like it just, very quickly transitions to dark. This is a pretty gradual transition to dark as it gets over this way. In fact, I've had some students in the past notice that kind of as the mountains go over, right? Think back to shape and value. Remember when we did those gradient transitions from light to dark in each of those shapes? When we shaded? So if we look at just this mountain, it goes from light to dark. Then if we look at just this mountain, it goes from light to dark. And then if we look at just this mountain, it goes from light to dark. But it gets a little bit darker each time. So it's a pretty subtle way to balance out this. But the fact that this is just as dark as that, okay, helps balance it out. But this is a really tiny little chunk of darkness, and that's a really big shape. Why can this little chunk here balance out that whole big shape? Do you guys remember? Think back to Christina's world. Girl in the pink dress sitting in the field, looking up at something in the distance. Do you remember how that little tiny house could balance out that whole person?
Because of the light behind it.
Because of the light behind it, okay? So because of the fact that there's a pretty intense spot of light right here, it's up against that dark, that creates, what is that when it's called? What is that called when there's light and dark pretty intense next to each other? Contrast, very good, I heard that. So when there's more contrast here, that's gonna help, okay? That's gonna help create more visual attention. There's one other thing that Van Gogh did that helps balance out that big thing. It has to do with this. Why can that little thing balance out that whole big thing?
Because it's in the distance.
Because it's in the distance. It's way far against this edge of the canvas. Okay, remember when we used the seesaw example? If you were sitting on a seesaw with like a kid that you were babysitting, right, and you wanted to seesaw together and not launch the child into like the stratosphere, right, you would have to move in and the child would have to move out on that seesaw because of physics. Does that make sense? So it's an actual physical thing even though it's only visual. It uses the same concepts and the same principles as what would on that seesaw example. Does that make sense? Okay, and we're going to look at another example of that that's a little bit more general in a little while. Okay, this is another head turner. Half of you are already there. Way to be prepared. All right. The Chicago Picasso. Have any of you ever seen this in person? Did I ask you that already? Yeah. Did I tell you about when we used to slide down the bottom when I was a little kid in the snow? I bet that was a pretty fun place this weekend. What type of balance is this using?
Approximate.
Approximate? I would agree. Did any of you have something different? Did any of you have pure for this? Or maybe think pure before you arrived at approximate?
Yes.
Okay. It does look pretty darn similar on each side, but what are those subtle differences that kind of help put it more in the approximate category?
The white lines.
The white lines. So are you looking at these?
These ones are longer than the other side.
Yep. So these lines here are a little bit longer than the ones over here. Okay, very subtle differences. Same thing is true if you look at like this distance here, this curve is a little bit narrower than the one on this side. So there's some little asymmetries about it, very subtle, but overall this would be approximate, very good. How about this one? Richard Diebenkorn, Berkeley 32. It's more abstract, right? There's not a specific recognizable subject matter in this. Maybe a landscape, but even still, it's pretty abstracted. What type of balance did you say on this one, or could you say on this one? This is sideways, by the way.
Is it inverted?
Not inverted.
I don't remember what it's called, but like, it's when it's a picture of like something, just an everyday thing, but it has like different colors for it.
You're talking like not a type of symmetry, but you're just talking like a particular style of art, abstract. When something is like exaggerated and portrayed unrealistically. Save that idea for like 2 projects from now. 'Cause that's a perfect example for that. What type of balance is this using? Not inverted. 4 other types we could choose from.
Asymmetry.
It could be asymmetry. There's probably another choice that would be closer. This is why we don't have art exams, because there'd be a lot of very gray areas with multiple choice.
Wait, what's the one? Okay, so I know the 4 or the 3. It's like approximate, pure, and inverted. But what's the other one?
Approximate, pure, inverted, and radial. It's not radial.
Shoot.
Bummer, I know.
I give up.
The 3 that you said, one of them was the correct one. Boolean.
Approximate.
What?
Those are approximate.
It is approximate. Very good. Now,
How?
asymmetry could definitely be a contender as well, okay? But if you look this way, you gotta turn your head. If you imagine that your line of axis here, your line of symmetry is here, okay?
Oh, I see.
Most of it is the same on both sides, or very similar, right? Close enough. Obviously, there's 2 kind of key areas where it's different from side to side, and that would be here versus here, and then here and here. So if you're focusing more on those, then I could totally see where you would say asymmetry, but the rest of it, like probably over half the painting, is more approximate. So approximate might be a stronger choice here. So gray area, possibilities, that probably could go either way. Does that make sense? Okay? Are we a little less confused now? How about this one? This one you can pick your head up the right way. So pure, approximate, inverted, radial, or asymmetry?
It's radial.
Not radial. There are some elements that might make us think, like if we just looked at little parts like this, right? That would be radially symmetric. This might be radially symmetric in small parts, but as a whole, what would it be? Most common form of balance?
Approximate.
Approximate symmetry, yes. Good. How about this one? A lot fewer colors, easier to balance. This is called a monochromatic color scheme. Bonus information. Julian?
Probably asymmetry.
Asymmetry, very good.
Approximate.
Approximate? I would say approximate's probably a good guess. What would be another good guess?
I don't know, you're asking a lot.
I am asking a lot.
Radial?
It has some radial elements, right? Because it feels like stuff is pulling out of the center. There's another one that fits though.
Be asymmetry or yeah.
Yes, asymmetry or approximate kind of skirts that line between, is it really close enough to be considered approximate? I don't know. Good thing there is not, you know, like I said, not a written exam, okay? But the idea is that you understand what those differences are so that at least you kind of can get close, right? Do not fall into the trap. What type of balance does this use?
It's not radial.
It's not radial.
It's
Good.
inverted.
It's not inverted.
Pure symmetry?
Not pure.
Approximate.
It is approximate. Yes. Okay. Now, if we were just looking at like one little section, then maybe you could make the argument for radial. Okay. You might have to like do some crossover and say like approximately radial or something like that. But yes, just because it has a circle does not mean that it is radially symmetric. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. Now we're going to learn how to manipulate them to get what we want. Okay? So in other words, remember when we looked at the Starry Night example, like 4 minutes ago, and we talked about how different things on one side could balance out the big dominant cypress tree element on the other side, right? So I need you as artists to have the ability, or to develop the ability now, to, as you're painting, to be able to say, okay, this is feeling really dominant, I need to do something on the other side that's going to help balance that out, okay? Or vice versa, maybe you've got a lot going on over here, you gotta be able to balance something out over here. The whole point here is, can you lead the viewer's eye around your painting, okay? And this, by the way, this applies to any type of art. Jewelry, ceramics, graphic design, interior design, fashion design, all of it, okay? Can you lead the viewer's eye so that they have the experience that you are designing your work to give? Does that make sense? So if you wanted or needed to communicate something with your work, they need to see it in a way that supports them getting that message, okay? So that's what we're going to focus on today. That's our goal for today, is to be able to determine, not just identify, but now we're going to start being able to control those qualities that affect visual balance, okay? So this is like making you the puppet master. So when you show people your work, can you control the experience that they're having? Okay? Now, that only goes to a point, right? Can you obviously like totally control somebody's interpretation of your work at all times? No. Right? But you can lead them in the direction that you want. And then the rest of it is they're going to be their interpretation and bringing their memories and associations and experiences to what you've created. Okay? So there's 4 things we need to look at when we're looking at how to control balance: size, complexity, placement, and contrast. Okay, so we're going to do the squint test here. Most of you are super sleepy, so the squint test is going to be a natural fit for you. When you squint and look at the screen, which one seems more dominant? Left or right?
Definitely the right.
The right seems more dominant to you?
I'm joking.
So the left seems more dominant in this case, right? I mean, left. Correct? Okay? Why? Because in general, okay, I'm speaking in like generalizations here, to be totally redundant. In general, bigger things are going to feel more dominant than smaller things when everything else is exactly the same. Does that make sense? Just remember, in general, bigger things are going to feel visually heavier. It's kind of like the seesaw example, right? Bigger things on the seesaw are going to weigh more. Makes sense, right? Okay, how about this one? Question.
Bigger's better.
Bigger is better. There are things we can compensate with, but yes. Of these 2, right or left, which one feels more dominant? Which one is kind of attracting your eye more?
Right.
The right one. Why is that? It's a different shape. Okay? It's still circular, but how does that circle compare to this one? It is more... It's more complex, right? So when everything else is the same, okay, in general, things that are more complex are going to attract more visual attention. They're going to carry more visual weight. This one's trickier. Think of the seesaw. Which one of these feels like it's pulling more of your attention?
The right
Close to
one.
the left.
Left or right? I've
Right.
heard one of each.
Right.
Right? Left. Think back to Van Gogh and the cypress tree. Think to a seesaw. Your seesaw was right here, right? Which side of the seesaw
Right.
would go down? The right would be heavier or the left? Autumn. Left would be heavier, yes. Why is that? It's probably the toughest question I'm going to ask you all day.
Other side.
Because it's closer to the edge of the canvas. Okay? So everybody always thinks, like, oh, put the most important thing in the center of your canvas. Well, you can do that, but depending on other circumstances, now there's lots of variables, right? But oftentimes around the edge of the canvas can carry more visual weight when all things are the same otherwise than things that are in the center. Okay? Now I don't want to like over confuse you here because your brains are tired enough, but some people will see this one as more dominant mainly because it has more negative space around it. It has kind of a target effect. And I think that's because it is round. Okay, our brains, that's like a human instinctual thing. We tend to look at round shapes. That's why babies that are just born, when they don't know anything, still will make eye contact with you because we're instinctually, programmed genetically, however you want to say it, to look at and make eye contact. Okay, so we're kind of targeted, no pun intended, to look at round things. So that might play into some of that, but in general, okay, if you think about the center being here, this one's going to carry more visual weight because it's farther away. Does that make sense? At least enough that you feel like you get it? Okay. How about this one?
Brighter.
The one that's brighter, right? So it's not just that it's brighter, okay, but it's actually that there's more contrast between the white and the black than there is between the gray and the black. Does that make sense? And that goes back to the Van Gogh example. That goes back to Christina's world with the house in the distance against the white sky. Okay, so when you want people to feel more visual weight in a certain area, let that area have more contrast. Believe it or not, you guys actually did this with your shape and value drawings as well. Remember we said you wanted your object, when you were overlapping all those shapes with it, we wanted your object to stay recognizable. You had to make sure that that outline of that object didn't get all like shaded in and muddled and confusing visually. You were actually using contrast. You were using this very concept to do that. You just didn't really have the awareness of how to explain what you were doing and why it was working. But does that make sense now? Okay. How about this one? You guys gotta really look at this one. Which one's your eye more drawn to?
The blurry one. The non-blurry.
Which one carries more visual weight?
A non-purple.
The non-blurry one. Yeah, doesn't this one feel like it's coming towards you more? Feels like it's advancing toward you a little bit. This is kind of like one of those tests that you have to do with the eye doctor when they check your vision, right? Photographers use this technique all the time, right? Think of when you've seen a portrait where somebody is in focus and the background behind them is blurry. Why would a photographer do that?
So you're more focused on the person.
So that the viewer's attention is more focused and more directed towards the person. That's the subject that they are intending to be important, right? So technically that's a contrast issue, right? If this has more contrast between the dark and the light areas, this has less contrast. It's a more gentle transition. So you can use your gradients and your blending to also affect your contrast. It's not just necessarily the actual different values. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Thank you for letting me know that you're paying attention. Here's kind of a combination of those two ideas, right? Now this should feel to you like a really big difference between this one and this one. Because not only is it way more complex in this one because of all those extra circles added in there, but it has a lot more contrast, obviously, than this one with no contrast at all within that circle. Does that make sense? Why would I show you an example that like is really clearly different? Guesses? What do you think?
It's too hard for me.
This is not fun. All right. The point here is that there are different levels of how different and how dominant or secondary we can make things, okay? There's like a continuum, okay? It's not just that everything that's dominant is automatically dominant and everything that's secondary is automatically secondary. There's kind of a continuum. You can make it a little more dominant or you can make it a lot more dominant. And as the artist, guess who has control over that? You. Okay? So it's not always going to be a clear-cut answer, but you have the ability now, by using these things, these ways to manipulate it, to make things very much more dominant if that's what you want your viewer to perceive. Question?
Well, with the one, right, is there kind of like a way to like, better judge if it's going in or out?
not from just this illustration. To be able to tell if this was going in or out, you would need more visual clues like shading or like a light source or like an environment or something like that. As an artist, just given that, you could decide which way you wanted that to be, and then you could add additional visual clues to be able to do that. That's a good question. Okay, so here is your task. Okay, and you can get started today, and then you're going to have work time. You don't have regular school tomorrow because of freshman, sophomore testing, but we will again on Thursday, right? So your task is going to be to use magazines or construction paper to find or create, if you can't find, at least one example of each type of balance. Okay, so you've got 5 types of balance, right? Asymmetry on the informal side. Then on the formal side you have pure, inverted, radial, and approximate. Okay, so you're going to look through magazines. You're going to find stuff like this, for example. So what type of symmetry would this full page ad be an example of? You could say approximate. You might even also be able to say inverted. Okay, it's a little bit more of a stretch to see inverted. But yes, absolutely, that would make sense. How about this one? We look at the whole page as a whole. What type of symmetry is that using? Not inverted.
I might say pure or approximate.
I would say, if given pure or approximate, I would say approximate is a better fit, mostly because of this difference here. Or maybe this, because it's like a different direction. I'd say approximate's a better fit for that. Does that make sense? What would this one be? This one kind of skirts the line between 2, doesn't it? Not inverted.
Or no, not that. Approximate.
Approximate or pure. Yep. And there's some subtle differences that would make it more towards approximate. One of them is the fact that this guy is right on center and he's kind of asymmetrical himself, right? He's facing one way. This one, this symbol makes it also kind of not technically purely symmetrical. How about this one?
Same thing.
Same thing, yep. If humans are going to be tough to make into pure symmetry because we are inherently asymmetrical, at least a little bit, right? But she's close enough that if that's all you had for pure symmetry, I would accept that. Okay? Just looking above this part, just at this part, what would you call it?
Approximate.
Approximate would be okay.
Inverted.
Inverted would be another possibility for this one. Okay? Because of the fact, remember we said inverted, you open your hands and then one goes upside down. So do you see how if you put your hands up like this, it would be approximate, and then you put one upside down, you get the inversion. Does that make sense? So you guys are going to be looking for stuff like this. You can bring in magazines from home if you want. Otherwise, I have tons of, I have a couple of different boxes of magazines of all sorts of varieties that are under the computers over here. So you guys are going to be cutting and pasting. You can do this in your sketchbook, or if you don't want to have cut and paste in your sketchbook, you can do it on a separate piece of paper too, that's fine. But you're going to find at least 5 examples, so one for each type of symmetry. And you're going to label what it is. Make sense? Questions?
No, no.
All right, awesome. If you need to make alterations so that it fits, you can do that too. That's not a problem. I would much rather see you take control over it so that I know you understand versus just tell me you can't find any, right?